segmento educativo de conversaciones tenemos hoy a un pensador de fama mundial. Me refiero a Steven Pinker, que estaba en Argentina convocado por el think tank Argentina 2030 a un proyecto, un programa de la Jefatura de Gabinete Nacional. Steven Pinker es un psicólogo cognitivo de la Universidad de Harvard y acaba de publicar un nuevo libro, tanto en inglés como en español, que se llama En defensa de la ilustración, por la razón, por la ciencia, por el progreso y por el humanismo. Y vamos a conversar de esas ideas que están atravesadas por el tema educativo y por el tema del conocimiento. Thank you so much, Steven, for being here today in Conversaciones de la Nación.
Thank you for having me.
Steven, it is very interesting that in order to think the present times, you have to go back to the past. For your thesis in the book, it is very important this historical period called in Spanish, la Ilustración, Enlightenment in English, and which appear in the history of humanity and the half of 18th century. Why these values and ideals of the Enlightenment period are so important to think the present?
I chose to focus on the Enlightenment because I wanted a name or a category for a set of ideas that I think we have to endorse: reason, science, humanism, and progress. And these ideas were most strongly articulated in the second half of the 18th century. And indeed, after the Enlightenment, you saw radical changes, for the better, mostly, in human living. You have the abolition of slavery. You had the first arguments against war and colonialism. You had the abolition of gruesome torture, like disemboweling or burning at the stake. You had a reduction in capital punishment. You had the first plans for democracy. You had the first arguments for trade and economic freedom. So many things that we enjoy today can be traced back to this period in human history.
You said the word endorse, no? Why do you need and we should need to highlight these ideals, endorse these ideals today?
Because many of them are threatened, particularly with the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism and populism, even fascism in Europe and the United States. We need to defend the alternative. Many people know that what they are against. They might say, well, I'm not religious, I'm not a nationalist, I'm not a populist, but what do we believe in? What do we argue for? And I argue that we have to know what it is that we believe in so that we're not just in opposing certain movements, but can make a positive statement as to what is valuable. And I would identify as those ideals reason, that is, we should try to analyze how the world works and how we should achieve our goals, not fall back on superstition or dogma or authority or conformity. We should use science to apply reason to understanding the world, to cure disease, to enjoy energy without pollution. Most of all, we need to embrace humanism. This is an ethical system that is not the same as religion, but it's a source of values such that we should try to improve the lives of men, women, and children, promote health and happiness and long life and education and social stimulation. If we don't know what we believe in, then we're not going to be effective in arguing against the things we don't believe in.
If I understand, what you say is that instead of being just critical of reality, we should need like a box of tools to work on reality. This is idea, and these ideals are the tools we need.
Exactly.
Okay.
That we should understand what the progress that we have made. We really do live longer than our ancestors. There are more democracies. There's less poverty. There's more literacy worldwide. There's less crime. There's less war. Not everywhere, but on average. We should figure out what has caused these improvements and do more of them.
Which is the role of education, the system of education, in this scenario? I mean, there are a lot of critics regarding how the quality of schools, the quality of learning is working today, but you are very focused on knowledge. So
Yes.
which is the role of education and the school and universities in this thesis you are developing?
It's fantastically important, both empirically in that countries that invest more in education become richer, become more democratic, are less likely to be involved in wars, are more likely to be happy, are likely to show even increases in intelligence. So education now predicts good things for society in the future. Why should that be so? Well, there are a number of reasons. The most obvious one is just the technical skills that are necessary to run a modern economy. Literacy, mathematical competence, ability to communicate, critical thinking and reasoning. But also, when you get an education, your view of the world changes. You realize that the way things are isn't the way things have always been. You learn that other countries do things in different ways, and perhaps you could learn from them. You learn that the mistakes of the past and how to avoid them. So it literally education expands your mind, and it's not just in theory that this should lead to good things for society, but the data show that.
I will be back on this issue. Now I want to present the idea of Ken Robinson. You know Ken Robinson, the British thinker, who is very critical of the educational system because according to his idea, it reproduces a way of building knowledge that is not working anymore in society, like the fabric system, no? The mass production of very similar individuals without critical thinking, that, according to his thesis, belongs to a period when this way of production matched the way of education was developed. So I find that this point of view is that you are describing of education, isn't it a bit optimist? Because schools are like the old-fashioned schools. They are still the same, with a teacher who is the authority in front of a classroom. In general, it's a very unequal relationship. He's supposed to have all the knowledge, and pupils are like filling these empty minds. But the world is working in a different way, more collaborative, resolving problems very difficult, but in teams. So are you sure that this educational system we have today is able to solution the problems that the future is presenting to us?
Certainly there are ways in which education can be improved and must be improved because the world is changing, the way we access information is changing, the demands of the workplace are not only changing but always will change. So it's the argument that I was making is that even the education system that we have is better than not having education at all. And countries that have more, that educate their students to a greater degree, have many positive outcomes. That's not to say that we can't have even more effective education. In fact, it's essential to figure out ways to make education, especially higher education, more widely accessible. University education, especially in the United States, is fantastically expensive, way too expensive, and many students can't afford it or get enormous amounts of debt. If we could figure out ways of bringing higher education to a wider range of people, that would be a huge benefit. And for primary and secondary education, also, there are undoubtedly more effective ways of teaching students than traditional schools have used. But even the traditional schools are better than not having education, yes.
You know, I'm sure you are aware of a debate in the pedagogical field regarding the way of this traditional way of teaching or a new way of teaching. For many decades, the systems are trying to change this relationship between students and teachers and between students and knowledge, so as to involve them mainly in secondary school, because the dropout in secondary school is very high in many countries. Primary school children tend to finish primary school, but not in secondary school. So the idea is that instead of these classes, these lessons where the teacher speaks and the pupils listen or the students listen, the new systems are trying to base the knowledge in this problem-solving process,
yeah,
or project-based teaching. Do you think that this way of organizing lessons is much more related to the way work, in this idea of, so as to resolve the big issues of humanity, we have to work in teams? This is the best approach to change or to better the work?
Well, certainly collaboration is an essential skill in a modern economy, as is critical thinking and communication. But it's very difficult to know what is going to be effective just by thinking about what is plausible,
yes,
what makes sense. I think we have to be empiricists. There have to be studies that try to test which pedagogical techniques are most effective, because a big problem in education is that there are fads, there are crazes, there are ideas, there are theories, and not all of them work. I think we have to have an open mind and try to test as rigorously as we can which of these ideas actually work in practice.
Yeah, because one of your ideas is that you have to count, to measure, to get measures
exactly, yes,
of what is happening really, so as not to be biased in
yes,
some way.
Also, for all of even though I am in favor of education for critical thinking and for collaboration, there's some parts of education that are always going to involve practice and memorization. Mm-hmm. And this is something that math teachers know, that even though it's essential to have insight as to what is a derivative, what is an integral, but unless the basic steps in mathematical reasoning are automatic, are second nature, you can multiply in your head, you can factor an equation just by looking at it, it gets harder and harder to learn the more advanced concepts.
Yeah.
The way the human mind works is that we, through practice, things that originally required a lot of cognitive effort become automatic.
Yeah.
And they become like modules, chunks, subroutines, and you can build more complex mental steps out of them. When they become automatic, still more complex mental steps. But there's always going to be hard work and exercises and repetition. I think it is a dream to think that we'll eliminate that from education altogether.
So memorizing is worthy, even we have Google.
Even when we have Google, even when we have pocket calculators.
Because your
yes,
mind is set in another way, and it is prepared to learn more.
That's right. It's like just when you learn to walk, first
yes,
you have to think through every step, or when you
yes,
learn to drive.
Yes, yes.
But then when it becomes automatic, you can drive and then use your mind to think about other things at the same time.
You know Martha Nussbaum, this very interesting philosopher, thinker in the States. She has a book, the title is Non-for-Profit, and she makes a case in favor of liberal arts and how important they are for democracy.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you have this very critical point of view regarding the chattering class, the intellectuals, the critics, the cultural critics that tend to be very against capitalism or progress or technology. In education for children and adolescents and young adults, do you think that how is this dialogue between liberal arts, humanities, social science, and technology and ciencias exactas, we say in
yes,
Spanish, we say in Spanish, this other kind of science, which is which kind of relationship should they keep?
I think they should be integrated. That many questions in history and social science, even in culture, are empirical propositions about the world. We know from cognitive science that the human brain is very easily fooled into seeing cause and effect relations that aren't there. Coincidences happen, and we overinterpret coincidences. We are also much too likely to give a lot of weight to vivid images, to narratives, to anecdotes. If there is a story about a gruesome crime in the news, we think crime is going up. If someone gets eaten by a shark, we think shark attacks are going up. That's just the way the human mind works. And one of the goals of education should be to provide tools of thinking that go beyond our own common sense, because we know our common sense can be fooled. And so history, I think, should be more quantitative. We should look at trends in history. We should also try to test hypotheses, either in the lab or with statistics, rather than going by our gut feelings or plausibility.
This is a very interesting point. The teaching of history, we tend to think that it is just the reviewing of the big facts, the main facts of history of past, and also the narratives that have been built to explain this fact. But you are proposing to use statistics to study the history of the past. But the problem is that in general, and this is a question, the teachers, history teachers, liberal art teachers, are not used to integrate this kind of this quantitative kind of point of view. So how we do in the classroom, no matter if it is university or it is secondary or primary school, to change this bias that history and liberal art teachers bring to the classroom?
Yes, I think that there has to be much more consilience, as E.O. Wilson has put it. That is a unification of knowledge. If you are a historian, you still should be familiar with statistical reasoning and probabilistic thinking and the use of data. Because there are many questions in history that can't be answered by individual anecdotes, but have to be answered by study. So, for example, is it true that democracies don't go to war? That's some people say that, and you could have some examples on one side, some examples on the other side. It's only when you do a complete inventory of all of the democracies, all of the wars, that you can test the hypothesis. The answer is, statistically, democracies are less likely to fight each other, although they are not less likely to get into war altogether. Or does peacekeeping work?
Yes.
Sometimes there are failures of peacekeeping, such as in Bosnia, but on average, peacekeepers do reduce the likelihood that countries will go back to war. This is not the kind of conclusion that you can reach looking at one event or another event. It's only by treating it as a statistical problem. And I think it's essential in education, in commentary, including on the op-ed page in newspapers, in intellectual life as a whole. We should become more conversant with statistical thinking.
Could you explain me the concept of availability bias that media, big media, big corporation media, introduce in the way we perceive and we see reality? Because in relation to this, I want to propose you an educational question.
Yes, the availability heuristic was discovered by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, two cognitive psychologists. And it refers to the fact that the human brain estimates probability by how easily it can recall examples. So if something happened yesterday, we think it's very likely. If we can remember a vivid image, then we think the probability is high. Now, sometimes that works. There really are, if I ask you what's more common in the cities, pigeons or nuthatches, you'll think, oh, have I seen a pigeon? Yes, pigeons are more common. And that's true.
Yes,
but whenever something is salient, just because it's more vivid, it happened more recently, it can distort your estimate of probability.
Yes.
And that's, of course, what terrorists exploit. They try to instill fear in a society because by committing acts of violence that are so vivid that everyone knows about them, even though statistically they are a tiny fraction of all deaths, even a tiny fraction of all violent deaths. There are far more ordinary homicides in bars and people fighting over a parking space than terrorist deaths. But because terrorism is designed to catch the attention of the news, because the news appeals to our availability, availability heuristic, we overestimate the danger from terrorists.
Well, having this scenario, teachers in general, well, on one side, they read papers, they read newspapers, so they are like determined by this heuristic bias, I call it.
Yes.
And on the other side, in general in Latin America and in Argentina, especially if we speak about Argentina, the education of teacher is in a ideological spectrum in the center left. They read kind of authors that come from the center left. So to the heuristic bias of media, of entertainment and media, there's an overlapping of another bias, the ideological bias. So,
yes.
so then they go to the classroom. How the quantitative point of view can be spreaded given all this bias?
Yes, I think that's a profound observation, because one cognitive bias that might be even stronger than availability is sometimes called the my side bias. The people in your tribe, your team, your coalition, you think that they are wise and knowledgeable and moral and noble, and the people on the other side you think are stupid and ignorant and evil and selfish. And both sides think that about the other side. Yeah. It even leads people to make errors in math. You look at a study, you give people some numbers. If the numbers support their point of view, they read them accurately. If they go against the point of view, they make errors in just reading the numbers.
Or they deny them.
Or they deny them, yes. Yeah. And we know that this is a problem in politicized debates, such as climate change, where the opposition to man-made climate change, at least in the United States, is not because of scientific ignorance. If you give tests of scientific literacy to people who deny climate change, people who accept climate change, they score the same.
Yeah.
What predicts the difference is simply how far to the left you are, how far to the right you are.
And so how the educational system fight against this kind of bias?
Yes.
What to do?
So you need political diversity in universities, in classrooms, in newspapers, because if everyone that you meet agrees with you, you'll never know what's wrong with your own opinions.
Yeah,
and so we should realize that together with diversity of gender and race and religion, we need diversity of political opinion. And people have to be aware that this is a cognitive bias. Our view of the world is distorted when it comes to political issues that belong to one political coalition or another.
Give me quote you a very interesting statistic. When it comes to political involvement, political participation among students, high school, for example, in Argentina, it is very common that they have at school a very well-organized political representation. But when they have to protest because of something, in general, something that it is a debate, agreeable out of school, a political issue, they occupy a school. They do not use this level of representations. They use their body to block the doors of the schools. They sleep over at the schools. So there's this organization, the OECD and Peace Assessment. There's another one called IEI, which is focused in math and science, peers and teams, other kind of assessment, which has run a study in Latin America in the second year of secondary school, asking students how they value different ideals of liberal democracy. And 69% of students in the second year of secondary school says that they prefer dictatorship instead of democracy when it comes to if dictatorship can give them order, security, and economic benefits. And 53% of them thinks that they could give a job to a friend for a public position in the state if they have the power to do this. So why do you think that youth, or adolescents, teenagers are being feel detached from the the best ideal of democracy, which is democracy is the system which can assure economic benefit and at the same time equality. What is happening?
Yes, it may be in part because teachers are ideologically on the left, that they haven't been willing to teach students about the benefits of democracy, of liberal democracy. This would include an appreciation of history, what happens in a dictatorship. In Argentina, of all places, that should be something that everyone knows.
Of course.
Now, of course, the students today weren't even born during the Dirty War, but they need to be reminded of the disappearances and the torture. They need to be reminded of what happens in countries like Spain and Nazi Germany and Maoist China when dictators seize power, and how the idea of a benevolent dictator usually doesn't last very long because dictators like their power and they are always going to abuse it.
But why aren't they embracing democracy, liberal democracy representation, asking the representatives in the Congress for their rights instead of occupying the streets? What is happening there? In Latin America, it's very common.
Yes, and it's, I mean, people have to be reminded that if you block the door, then all it shows is that you're stronger than someone else. It doesn't show that you're right.
Yeah. Okay.
That really, that there have to be procedures that all sides agree to, rules of the game. That don't depend on muscle or brute force, but that depend on how persuasive your arguments are.
Well, Steven, it was wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Fue Steven Pinker en Conversaciones de la Nación.